Hello, and welcome back to Seeds of History. I'm your host, Bennett Tanton, here to take you on another journey through time, digging up the roots of history, one fascinating story at a time. Today we're heading down to the sunny shores of Florida, but not for a beach vacation. Nope. We're talking about a culture you've probably never heard of, the safety harbor culture. Think ancient mound builders, coastal ingenuity, and a people who thrived long before the state became synonymous with theme parks and retiree golf carts. Now I know what you're thinking. Bennett, I'm not much of an archaeologist. Why should I care about a bunch of ancient shell mounds? Well, stick around, and I promise by the end of this episode you'll be dropping fun facts about the safety harbor people at your next dinner party, or at least feeling a little smarter than when you hit play. Over the next hour, we'll dive into the origins, daily life, spiritual practices, and eventual decline of this fascinating culture. We'll also talk about why preserving their legacy matters in a world where ancient history often gets bulldozed to make room for strip malls. Before we get started, let me remind you, if you enjoy Seeds of History, don't keep it a secret. Like, share, and review the podcast. It helps more history nerds, casual learners, and maybe even your mildly curious uncle find us. All right, buckle up, because we're about to embark on a journey to a time when Florida wasn't just about oranges and alligators, but about a resilient and resourceful people who left behind clues to a life most of us can barely imagine. To understand the safety harbor culture, we first have to rewind the clock, way back to a time before Spanish explorers and souvenir shops took over Florida. We're talking roughly 900 CE. Picture a Gulf Coast teeming with wildlife, dense mangroves, sparkling waters, and skies filled with birds. It was in this lush landscape that the safety harbor culture took root, growing out of the legacy of an earlier indigenous group known as the Weeden Island culture. Now, the Weeden Island people were no slouches. They laid the groundwork for many of the traditions the safety harbor culture would build on, like mound building and a knack for turning seashells into tools, jewelry, and even currency. The safety harbor folks inherited this foundation, but they didn't just copy-paste it. They made it their own, adapting their way of life to the coastal environment with a level of sophistication that would make even the most hardcore survivalists take notes. Their name, Safety Harbor, comes from the modern town where archaeologists first uncovered their ancient remnants. But let's be clear, these people didn't call themselves the Safety Harbor culture. That's a name we slapped on them centuries later, probably because calling them shell mound architects of the Gulf was a bit of a mouthful. So, what made these people unique? Well, for starters, they were expert adapters. Living along Florida's Gulf Coast meant they had to contend with hurricanes, swampy terrain, and the occasional hungry gator. But instead of fighting the environment, they worked with it. They turned the resources around them into tools for survival, and thrived in a way that's frankly enviable when you think about modern supply chain issues. Archaeological evidence suggests that the safety harbor people lived in relatively small communities, often centered around a ceremonial mound or plaza. These mounds weren't just piles of dirt, they were purpose-built structures, often used for religious ceremonies, community gatherings, or as burial sites. The largest of these is the Felipe Park Mound, located in Pinellas County. This impressive structure stands as a testament to their engineering skills and social organization. The mounds also tell us something else about the safety harbor culture. They weren't living in isolation. Their pottery styles and artifacts show influences from other cultures, suggesting they were part of a broader trade network that extended across the southeastern United States. This network allowed them to acquire materials like copper and exotic shells, which weren't exactly lying around in their backyard. But life wasn't all mounds and trade routes. The Safety Harbor people also faced challenges. Their reliance on the coastal environment made them vulnerable to natural disasters and resource scarcity. Yet they adapted, proving their resilience time and time again. So, to recap, the Safety Harbor culture sprang from the fertile soil of the Weeden Island tradition, grew into a society defined by its adaptability, and left behind monumental mounds as silent witnesses to their ingenuity. Not bad for a group that most of us had never heard of until now, huh? Let's zoom in on daily life for the Safety Harbor people. Imagine waking up to the sound of waves lapping against the shore, birds squawking overhead, and maybe the faint rustle of palmetto leaves in the breeze. If this sounds like paradise, well, you're not entirely wrong. The Gulf Coast environment was a veritable buffet for the Safety Harbor people, but only if you knew how to work with it. At the heart of their economy was the coast itself. The Safety Harbor culture revolved around fishing, shellfish harvesting, and gathering other marine resources. Oysters, clams, and fish weren't just dinner. They were the cornerstone of survival. And let's be honest, who doesn't appreciate a good seafood platter? But instead of cocktail sauce and lemon wedges, they had ingenuity and sustainable practices. The shell mounds that dot the region, massive heaps of discarded shells and other debris, are like ancient garbage dumps. They tell us not only what these people ate, but also how they lived. Over time, these mounds grew into landmarks, sometimes repurposed into platforms for ceremonies, or even housing foundations. Talk about resourceful recycling. Speaking of housing, archaeologists believe the Safety Harbor people lived in modest dwellings made of natural materials like wood, palm fronds, and vines. These structures were likely arranged around communal spaces, reflecting a tightly knit society. Imagine a neighborhood without fences, where everyone knew everyone, and the biggest HOA rule was, don't let your canoe drift into the mangroves. But life wasn't all about survival. Art and craftsmanship were an important part of their culture. Their pottery, often adorned with intricate designs, suggests a strong aesthetic sense. These weren't just utilitarian objects. They were a form of expression, possibly even a status symbol. Trade was another lifeline for the Safety Harbor people. Remember, they weren't holed up on some isolated beach. They were part of a vibrant network that stretched across the southeast. Goods like copper, mica, and rare shells flowed into their communities, while their own products, like fish and shell tools, likely flowed out. It's a reminder that even ancient societies were more interconnected than we often imagine. And then there's their diet. Sure, seafood was the star of the show, but they also gathered fruits, nuts, and other plants to round out their meals. Evidence suggests they hunted small game, and possibly even deer, adding a little surf and turf to their menu. What's fascinating is how they balanced all of this with the changing seasons and the occasional curveball from Mother Nature, like a hurricane or a red tide. One thing that stands out about the Safety Harbor people is their relationship with the environment. They weren't just living off the land, they were living with it. This wasn't some utopian harmony, but a practical understanding that their survival depended on respecting and managing their resources. It's a lesson we could all take to heart today. So picture it, A coastal community where survival wasn't just about scraping by but thriving, where people worked hard, played a little, and left behind a legacy that would speak volumes to those of us lucky enough to dig it up centuries later. Now, let's talk about what really sets the safety harbor culture apart, their spiritual practices and the monumental mounds they left behind. These weren't just piles of dirt, they were symbols of their beliefs, their social structure, and their connection to the cosmos. If daily life was the bread and butter of their existence, these mounds were the gourmet dessert. The mounds built by the safety harbor people served multiple purposes, but at their core, they were sacred spaces. These earthen monuments ranged from flat-topped ceremonial mounds to burial mounds, each constructed with a precision and purpose that would make modern architects do a double take. Take the Felipe Park Mound, for example, rising nearly 20 feet high. This mound isn't just an impressive feat of engineering, it's a glimpse into the spiritual heart of the safety harbor culture. Archaeologists believe these mounds were platforms for temples, homes of leaders, or ceremonial activities. And let's be honest, if you're going to build something that stands the test of time, you might as well make it the centerpiece of your community. But what were these ceremonies? The truth is, we're working with educated guesses here. There's evidence to suggest they had a strong belief in an afterlife, which explains the elaborate burial practices. Skeletons buried in mounds were often accompanied by grave goods, pottery, tools, and even shell ornaments. These weren't random trinkets. They were carefully chosen items meant to help the deceased in the next life. And it wasn't just about the individual. These mounds likely played a role in uniting the community. Picture everyone gathering at the base of a mound for rituals, storytelling, or even debates about whose turn it was to paddle the canoe. The mounds were both spiritual and social hubs, embodying the interconnectedness of their beliefs and daily lives. Now, let's zoom out for a moment. The safety harbor mounds weren't built in isolation. They were part of a broader tradition of mound-building cultures across North America. From the towering earthen pyramids of Cahokia to the smaller burial mounds of the Mississippian cultures, these structures reflect a shared understanding of the spiritual significance of shaping the land. For the safety harbor people, the act of building a mound wasn't just practical, it was sacred. Here's where it gets even more fascinating. The alignment of some mounds suggests they were designed with astronomical considerations in mind. The safety harbor people didn't have telescopes or planetariums, but they had an eye on the stars. These alignments hint at a worldview that placed their lives within a cosmic framework, connecting their ceremonies to the movements of the sun, moon, and stars. In a way, the mounds are like time capsules, preserving not only the physical remains of their builders, but also a glimpse into their spirituality and social structure. They remind us that these were not just primitive people scraping by. They were architects, astronomers, and storytellers, weaving the physical and spiritual worlds into one cohesive tapestry. Of course, the mounds also raise questions. How were they built? How many people did it take? And why do we, as modern humans, have such a hard time building anything without going over budget? The mounds stand as a testament to the resilience and creativity of the safety harbor culture. They're a reminder that even in a world without cranes or concrete, human ingenuity and belief can shape the landscape in profound and lasting ways. If there's one thing history teaches us, it's that even the most resilient societies are vulnerable to forces beyond their control. For the safety harbor culture, those forces came crashing onto their shores in the form of European explorers. What had been a thriving, adaptive community for centuries suddenly faced challenges that no amount of ingenuity or mound building could prepare them for. It all started in the early 1500s, when Spanish explorers like Panfilo de Narvaez and Hernando de Soto began poking around Florida's Gulf Coast. To the Europeans, the Safety Harbor people were just another indigenous group to conquer, convert, and exploit. But to the Safety Harbor people, these visitors weren't just strange. They were harbingers of an entirely new world order. With the arrival of Europeans came diseases like smallpox, measles, and influenza, diseases to which the Safety Harbor people had no immunity. It's estimated that these epidemics wiped out a staggering percentage of the indigenous population across the Americas, and the Safety Harbor culture was no exception. The same interconnected trade networks that had once brought prosperity now became conduits for catastrophe, spreading illness faster than any ship or soldier could. And it wasn't just the diseases. The Spanish explorers brought with them an entirely different worldview, one that often clashed violently with indigenous beliefs and practices. The ceremonial mounds and burial traditions that had defined the Safety Harbor culture for centuries were dismissed as pagan or primitive by the Europeans. In many cases, these sacred sites were looted or destroyed, their cultural significance lost to colonial greed. Conflict wasn't far behind. As Spanish expeditions moved deeper into Florida, they disrupted indigenous trade routes, food supplies, and social structures. The Safety Harbor people found themselves increasingly squeezed, facing threats not only from European forces, but also from other indigenous groups who were themselves displaced or emboldened by access to European weapons and goods. By the mid-1600s, the Safety Harbor culture had all but vanished. Some of their descendants likely merged with other indigenous groups, like the Calusa or the Appalachee, while others may have been enslaved or forcibly relocated. The exact details remain murky, but the end result is clear. The vibrant, adaptive culture that had thrived along Florida's Gulf Coast for centuries was no longer a distinct entity. It's tempting to think of this as a tragic but inevitable outcome, a small culture caught in the tidal wave of history. But let's push back on that idea for a moment. The Safety Harbor people didn't just disappear. They were erased, their way of life systematically dismantled by forces that valued conquest over coexistence. And while we can't go back and change what happened, we can honor their legacy by telling their story and preserving the traces they left behind. So what can we learn from the decline of the Safety Harbor culture? For one, it's a stark reminder of how interconnected the world was, even in an era long before globalization. The same networks that sustained them ultimately contributed to their downfall, showing how delicate the balance of survival can be. It's also a cautionary tale about the consequences of cultural arrogance. The Europeans who dismissed the Safety Harbor people as savages failed to see the complexity and value of their society. And let's not pretend we're above that today. How often do we overlook or undervalue the wisdom of those who see the world differently from us? The decline of the Safety Harbor culture is a somber chapter in their story. But it's not the end. The mounds they built, the artifacts they left behind, and the resilience they showed in the face of adversity all speak to a legacy that deserves to be remembered and respected. Although the safety harbor culture faded centuries ago, their story is far from over. In many ways, their legacy lives on, not just in the artifacts and mounds they left behind, but in the ongoing efforts to understand, preserve, and share their history. Let's start with the mounds themselves. These towering earthworks are some of the most tangible reminders of the safety harbor culture. Sites like the Felipe Park Mound in Pinellas County have become important landmarks, protected from development and recognized as crucial pieces of Florida's heritage. Today, visitors can walk among these ancient structures, gaining a glimpse, albeit an incomplete one, into a world that existed long before European contact. But the mounds aren't just for tourists. Archaeologists have spent decades studying them, piecing together the story of the Safety Harbor people through careful excavation and analysis. Each pottery shard, shell tool, and burial site adds another layer to our understanding of how these people lived, worked, and worshipped. Advances in technology like ground-penetrating radar and DNA analysis are even allowing researchers to uncover new details without disturbing these sacred sites. Preservation efforts go beyond the mounds. Museums and historical societies across Florida are working to keep the Safety Harbor culture in the public eye. Exhibits showcasing their artifacts, like intricately designed pottery or tools fashioned from shells, help tell their story in a way that's accessible and engaging. These institutions are also tackling the difficult but necessary conversations about colonization and its devastating impact on Indigenous peoples. And then there's the question of how to engage with this history respectfully. For many descendants of Florida's Indigenous peoples, the Safety Harbor mounds and artifacts aren't just historical relics, they're sacred. Balancing the need for academic research with the importance of honoring Indigenous beliefs is a challenge, but it's one that many organizations are taking seriously. Collaborative efforts with Indigenous groups are helping to ensure that preservation isn't just about the past. It's about respect and responsibility in the present. What's perhaps most inspiring is how the story of the Safety Harbor culture continues to resonate today. Their resilience in the face of environmental challenges offers lessons for how we might navigate our own uncertain future. Their ability to adapt to a changing world, to build a community centered on shared values and spiritual connection, reminds us of what's possible when we work with the natural world rather than against it. But there's also a cautionary tale here. The erasure of the Safety Harbor culture is a stark reminder of how easily history can be lost. In our rush to modernize, to build the next condo complex or shopping mall, we risk bulldozing not just land, but the stories embedded within it. If we don't make an effort to protect and celebrate this history, we risk losing it forever. So, what can we do? First, we can educate ourselves and others. Sharing stories like the Safety Harbor culture helps to keep their memory alive and ensures that their contributions aren't forgotten. Supporting preservation efforts, whether through volunteering, donating, or simply advocating for historical sites, can make a tangible difference. Most importantly, we can approach history with curiosity and humility. The Safety Harbor people may seem like a distant chapter in the human story, but their challenges, triumphs, and innovations echo through time. By listening to their story, we can learn something about ourselves and maybe even find inspiration for the future. The legacy of the Safety Harbor culture isn't just in the mounds they built or the artifacts they left behind. It's in the lessons they offer us, the questions they inspire, and the responsibility we carry to honor their memory. And that's a wrap on today's episode of Seeds of History. We've journeyed through the origins, daily life, spiritual practices, and eventual decline of the safety harbor culture. From their awe-inspiring mounds to their remarkable adaptability, the safety harbor people remind us that history isn't just about dates and dusty artifacts. It's about stories of resilience, ingenuity, and sometimes tragic loss. Now here's the part where I remind you to spread the word. If you enjoyed this episode, don't keep it to yourself. Share it with a friend, drop a review, and hit that like button wherever you're listening. Your support helps us grow, and let's be honest, the world could use a few more history buffs. Got a topic you'd love to hear on Seeds of History? Reach out and let me know. I'm always looking for the next fascinating story to dig into. Who knows, your suggestion might just make it into a future episode. Thanks for joining me today and for taking the time to learn about a culture that deserves more than to be forgotten. Together, we're planting the seeds of understanding and keeping history alive, one story at a time. Until next time, I'm Bennett Tanton, signing off. Stay curious, stay inspired, and as always, keep seeking out those hidden corners of history.